On today's DCU Daily, does Netflix really want to restore the Snyderverse? Can they afford to buy Warner Brothers Discovery outright? Or are Netflix and Warner Brothers Discovery planning a huge merger? Or is it all online internet bullshit? Let's delve into it. Welcome back to Movies TV Mad. I am Mick, your host with the most just your girlfriends, wives, and especially your boyfriends and your husbands. A very warm welcome to Movies TV Mad. I am Mick Meanus. You can follow me on X, Twitter, at Movies TV Mad, and on Instagram and on Threads at Movies TV Mad. X on Snapchat, BMouth60, and on, where else? TikTok, Mad Mickey's World. So very warm welcome. And welcome to, is it Thursday or Friday? I don't know what the bloody day is. I think it's Friday's edition of the DCU Daily. Welcome, welcome, welcome. What's very interesting about this situation is this, that the other day a fan on Vero posted about Netflix acquiring DC or Warner Brothers Discovery, and Zack Snyder liked it. Zack Snyder is not a stupid man. He likes things purposefully to create a situation. He does clearly know more about this situation than we do, but again, it proves that Snyder doesn't want to move on. I still remember the day that James Mangold, when we were fighting for the Snyder Cut, went onto Twitter and told us to move on, to allow Zack Snyder to move on. That Zack Snyder wanted to move on, even though he didn't know Zack Snyder. I said something and got blocked by him. James Mangold was obviously wrong. Zack Snyder hasn't moved on, and he will never move on. But anyway, in terms of Netflix restoring the Snyderverse or buying Warner Brothers Discovery or DC Comics, it's a very interesting situation. So because there's been this Snyder fan kind of momentum for ages, the hashtag sell Snyderverse to Netflix, the other day I decided to start doing some investigating and talk to my sources inside of Netflix. It's a very, very complex but interesting situation. Netflix would absolutely like to restore the Snyderverse. Now, what's very, very interesting about this situation is Dan Lin, who now works with Netflix. I think he runs the movie side of that organization. What's ironic and interesting about Dan Lin, he was interviewed by David Zaslav to be the co-CEO of DC Studios. Dan Lin is a huge DC fan. But he was caught once in a podcast or something saying something derogative about the Snyderverse. He claims he was a little bit misquoted. Look, it's all about money at the end of the day. There is interest in the Snyderverse, and I don't know what the DCU would do if Netflix did, or anyone, restored the Snyderverse. Because basically, nobody's got that much interest in James Gunn's DCU as it is. If they restore the Snyderverse, nobody is going to give a shit. And look, there's lots of complexities, which would come into play when you talk about restoring the Snyderverse. You'd have to bring Cavill back. Could you bring Cavill back? Could you bring Gal Gadot back? Could you bring Ray Fisher back? Jason Momoa, who's kind of involved with the DCU as well now. What would he do? Now, we know he's very loyal to Zack Snyder, so you've got those situations. I'm quite confident that all the actors would absolutely return if the Snyderverse was restored. But from the questions I asked my sources and people inside of Netflix, there is an interest in acquiring Warner Brothers Discovery, or at least DC Comics. Now, is there anything going on there? Let's cast our minds back when this movement to sell Snyderverse to Netflix first began. Mr. James Gunn, the co-CEO of DC Studios, someone who should be withdrawn from these situations, called it a very, what did he call it? A very freaky movement, or whatever he said. He was derogative. He was very derogative about the movement. You shouldn't be even commenting on that movement, but he was triggered. He was triggered. I remember once when someone said they missed Henry Cavill as Superman, he said, he hasn't gone anywhere. Why are you missing him? He's still alive. You know, proving how triggered this guy is, how afraid this guy is of the Snyderverse. And my friends, the panic from James Gunn and his followers is real. Because yesterday he went on to Fred's. It's been a week of conversations about the Batman 2. Matt Reeves has been talking about his highly anticipated sequel to the Batman. Gunn's kind of like this guy who, when he goes to a party, he wants everyone to talk to him and nobody else. He's an attention seeker. He has an ego. He is scared. And he's still trying to create hype over the remainder of the Peacemaker 2 season, which doesn't have many viewers, not much interest attached to it. They are trying their best. There's not much hype around Man of Tomorrow either. And he's trying to create hype around Man of Tomorrow. He said Man of Tomorrow was easier to write than Superman. Probably because Superman isn't the main character in that film. He's one of many characters. So he doesn't have to be afraid of how he represents Superman. I think he made a goddamn awful mess of representing and writing Superman in that movie. I don't think he enjoyed making Superman at all. He never wanted to make a Superman movie. I've spoken about that before. But Gunn is very, very worried because he knows if the Snyderverse is restored, he's fucked. Because there is a scenario, of course, that WB sells its assets separately to different companies, which would be very interesting. So imagine DC Comics going to Netflix and Harry Potter going to another company. Stuff like that. Very, very interesting, of course. But say DC Comics does go to Netflix, or let's say they were able just to give Netflix the rights to make Snyderverse content, which would be something totally separate to everything else. Gunn would still be fucked. Because whether you love or hate Snyder or the Snyderverse, everyone wants to still talk about Snyder and the Snyderverse. I don't see many people talking about the DCU, apart from those DCU shills. They failed everyone. They tried their best. They tried the best to create hype, the creative accounting over this Superman movie. None of it has worked. They have failed. Man of Steel, the first Snyderverse movie, was released in June of 2013, if I've got that date correct. That's a long fucking time ago, and people are still obsessed about the Snyderverse. The Snyderverse movement has got so many millions of people around the world attached to it. People would watch Snyderverse DC movies and TV. People would. There's money to be made from this. Whatever people say, there's money to be made. There's an interest in Snyder restoring the Snyderverse. It's something that would, excite me hugely. And I want to see. But I think we're at a moment where it's going to take a while to get this done, if it's going to get done. But, there's so many scenarios because, look, Warner Brothers Discovery are a company hemorrhaging money. They have to sell. What I don't know, and what none of my sources know actually, is what the plan is. To sell it, to slice the cake and say, here's some of this here, and here's some of that there. That's what we don't know at this time. I'm not overly confident that they're going to sell the entire company. But it depends about money. If someone's going to give them stupid money for the entire company, then they could do it. I still suspect we're looking at a merger, which wouldn't necessarily be the best thing if you want to see the Snyderverse restored. So, yeah, as I say, I believe that Netflix are interested in at least acquiring DC Comics. I think they are interested in restoring the Snyderverse, so keep pushing for that. You're all doing very well with the sell Snyderverse to Netflix movement. It has a lot of interest towards it. Whether this can be a reality, I don't know at this moment. But I think there is interest from Netflix to do this. And I mean, let's say if Netflix did acquire WB, it would make them the biggest Hollywood studio in the world, because Warner Brothers is huge. Despite the money that Warner Brothers are hemorrhaging, they are one of the biggest studios in the world. And they own so many different IPs. And, you know, the Warner Brothers name is a fantastic name for, you know, over 100 years. They've been making fantastic movies. Now, obviously, they've made a lot of mistakes. Nobody's really making great movies these days anyway. It's not just Warner Brothers that's the problem. They're all the fucking problem. And driving Zack Snyder away was a very bad move for WB. Look, David Zaslav and Warner Brothers Discovery see how often the Snyderverse is trending. But still, they made the decision to put James Gunn in charge of DC Studios, which wasn't a prudent decision. I don't even understand the thinking behind putting Gunn and Safran in charge of DC. Safran produced many DCEU flops, as we've discussed many times, and Gunn clearly is a one-trick pony. He doesn't know how to make varied DC movies and TV shows, right? So it's not going to work. It hasn't worked. It's not working. And, you know, someone has to grab hold of DC and do something with it. And I think the only way forward is to look at DC not as a unit, not as a franchise that's connected, but something where different creatives can take different pieces of it and make their own thing for it. I think that's the future of film. People are done with franchises. People talk about superhero fatigue. You could have 100 superhero movies a year, and if each of those 100 were good individual movies made by great writer-directors, written beautifully, directed beautifully, then you're going to make money. Because the secret behind being successful in the entertainment industry is entertaining people. That's it. It is not complicated. It's not about studying trends. It's not about studying what people say on the internet. It's about taking Batman or Superman or Wonder Woman or even Plastic Man or whoever you fucking want, and doing something amazing with them and wowing the audience. And there is a huge interest and a huge audience for the Snyderverse. No matter what the haters say, it doesn't really matter. At the end of the day, right, I don't believe you should have 6 versions of Superman at the same time, or have 2 Batmen at the same time. It's a complicated situation. Could you have a Henry Cavill Superman over at Netflix and then a James Gunn Superman somewhere else? Listen, James Gunn's Superman isn't profitable, and Henry Cavill's is. Henry Cavill's Man of Steel was profitable in the cinema. Maybe not as profitable as they wanted it to be, right? And I agree, a Superman movie should be making more money, and a Batman and Superman movie should be making more money, but wow, Batman vs Superman did do really good, solid bank. The Snyderverse had great interest on HBO Max, one of the most hugest viewing scenarios that a streaming company has ever had. The physical media for the Snyderverse is huge. There's an interest here for this franchise and this property. And ignoring it makes you bad business people, makes you incompetent. It's one of the major reasons you're all on your knees and you're about to go bankrupt, and why you need to sell this company again. Because you have had the honor of running one of the greatest studios in Hollywood history, and you've all been running it into the ground, whether it's Time Warner, AT&T, and now Discovery. All of you have made a pig's ear of running that studio. But even worse, your running of DC movies has been a disaster. At least the Snyderverse was compelling and epic. At least Smallville was a great Superman adaptation, a visionary adaptation. The first couple of seasons of Arrow and The Flash were fantastic. It doesn't all need to be connected. You can have separate versions of these DC characters. But whoever grabs hold of DC Comics next has to tap that untapped potential.